Good morning, everybody. I hope you are well. It is Sunday, the 19th of November, and welcome to the weekly review, where we go through some of the big stories that have happened in education this week. And this week I am joined by Christopher Vowles, John Gibbs, and Kathryn Taylor. So good morning to all of you. How are you doing? Everyone well? Thumbs up, all good. Everyone got their coffee and ready to go. So we've got a lot to get through in the next 30 minutes, including a look at teacher wellbeing, another look at homelessness amongst 16, 17-year-olds, and finishing out with looking at the inquiry into financial education. So without further ado, let's get cracking, shall we? Okay, so it was revealed this week that teacher wellbeing has reached its lowest level in 5 years, with stress, insomnia, and burnout all continuing to rise, and that being a teacher in some cases is unsustainably demanding. Worsening wellbeing was found amongst England's school staff, with rates for teachers at their lowest since 2019, and even below that of senior leaders. So if you look at this graph, you can see that teacher wellbeing as a whole, for the first time since I believe 2019, has actually fallen below that of head teachers, which is unbelievable. Christopher, I just want to come to you first, because I suppose this is not new information to us. Teacher wellbeing has been problematic for a long time, but certainly since the pandemic, it has been clear that, well, we are in big trouble.
It has. I think it's worth us being clear about how stress differs from pressures on well-being. So the World Health Organization defines stress as a state of worry or mental tension caused by a difficult situation. So in that sense, the findings are unsurprising, given that teachers are managing their own personal difficult situations on top of those of students and families. I mean, life as a teaching DSL must be very hard indeed in 2023. But if you look across other professions too, stress surveys are reporting similar findings since about 2019. We get something similar in the NHS and in the legal profession in England in terms of low morale. We get it also in the armed services in 2022 on different criteria. So I suppose I was thinking about what the connections between those different professions might be. And it seems to me that all of those professions, teaching being a particularly notable one, is about working with large groups of people, which is inherently stressful, I'd say, especially where relationships are short-lived, transitory, and held together through admin. So if we're thinking about what we need to do, what schools could do to make life easier, one of those things has got to be building positive routines and enhancing relationships. It'd be a good idea for every school to have a communal staff room used by all teachers and senior leaders. Senior leaders are teachers. To have routine focal points in the week where staff can connect with one another, which isn't related to just how well student X is performing in their class. And a safe space for venting, I think. I think teachers do need that from time to time. Hopefully, Teachers Talk Radio gives some staff the opportunity to benefit from each of those areas in a suitably professional way.
Well, yes, and just later on in this particular article, it talks about, for the first time, education support actually asked about the impact of inspections on mental health. And of course, this sadly comes in the wake of the death of Ruth Perry last year. And Kathryn, I just wanted to come to you and ask about how important and how significant it is to be asking teachers about the impact of Ofsted.
In terms of Ofsted, I think it's an interesting one because obviously it's like the sword of Damocles, isn't it? It's always hanging over, and there are some leaders who take it in their stride and say, you know, we're confident in what we do. If they come, do your best. We're ready. We've been prepared. And there are others, I think, who are perhaps more nervous and panicking. And I think, it's very difficult for that stress not to be permeated down. And I think from the way I understand the framework currently, it's very much focused on the middle leaders and whether they are being effective, because often I think the senior leaders will have been judged through the website, through the documentation that Ofsted will have read before they even come through the door in many cases, and a lot of that in the 90-minute phone call as well before they arrive on site. And then it's down to the middle leaders getting hopefully a nice talk, but perhaps a grilling, and the stress as well of knowing whether or not the people in your team are going to say the same things as you. So if you say we're going to go and see, something like a bit of geology or something like that in geography, and you get there and they're doing cities, then you've got a problem. So I think a lot of it is resting at the middle level now. And I've got to say, I do worry a little bit about how teachers can cope with this, because we all now live in a world where we see friends and relatives having flexible working and having work from home and hybrid working. And I think there's an expectation setting issue in terms of our work-life balance, which is a separate issue from the Ofsted issue, but which I think is also playing into this. I think this is quite a complex, perfect storm of issues, really.
And there's certainly been discussion on Twitter this week about a typical day as a teacher, and there's been some healthy debate, I should say, about what constitutes a healthy day as a teacher, and should we really be getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning? Is that really necessary in order to be doing everything that we need to do in a day? Now, John, I know you're someone who has been out of the teaching game for a little bit, but I suppose what I want to know from you is, in looking at all of this, I mean, it makes for quite sort of sad reading. I mean, again, in a way, it's information that we already know. We certainly, when you're reading statistics like when you're looking at wellbeing scores, and that scores between 41 and 45 are considered high risk. And if you look at the graph that Tom posted on screen earlier, a lot of those scores are edging very close to, or indeed are above that number. Where do we go from here? What are the urgent next steps in your mind? Because I think it's all well and good telling us, that we are at risk and we are aware of this, but yes, now what?
Is that me?
Yes, it's you, John.
All right, sorry. Sorry, my internet faded out exactly the moment of my introduction there. It's hard to know. The thing is, in sort of preparing to thinking about this, I agree both with Christopher that there's a context going on which affects all public services. It's austerity, it's inflation, it's the times we live in. And I agree that with Kathryn, that something has happened in teaching. So in a sense, I was ready to answer the long view. And it seems to me that in my years of teaching I'm now retired, but and by the way, I'm now retired, but often inflicted by dreams of being in classrooms where piles of coursework haven't been marked or something. Literally 2 years on from retirement or 3 years on from retirement, and I still feel a sense of obligation for things undone that were, I don't know. So yeah, teaching. So right from the beginning of my career, teaching was always kind of stressful. I mean, everyone knows that teaching's a job which is it's a fairly high octane job. When you close the classroom door, you've got 30 in front of you. It's the beginning of a new term. You'll be surprised. There's a high level of anxiety. But over the years, the culture did shift. Something moved from collegiality to accountability. And it wasn't just Ofsted. It was within schools where things, but kind of benign sounding things that were really a kind of passive aggression, which is, learning walks. Oh, we're going on a learning walk. That means people turning up and watching you. We're going to do a quality check. That means people looking at your books of your marking and critiquing you, and so on. And all sorts of the fabric of that accountability became, in the worst cases, a form of bullying. And in other schools, well, maybe supportive and collegial still. But that did shift and change during those careers. Where we go from here, well, I'm not in the profession anymore. So, but it's a cultural shift which is going to be hard to change. And I hope one of my recent guests I had on our show talked about the beginning of the end of neoliberalism, the kind of this long, unpleasant period when we have marketized education and turned students into consumers and teachers into the providers of a product, maybe that'll come to an end. I'd like to think so.
Well, this is something that we will definitely keep an eye on. Wellbeing is something that is very close to many of our hearts at Teachers Talk Radio, so I'm sure you will hear more on this. But I should also remind you at this point that this show is brought to you by John Catt, or in partnership with John Catt Educational, I should say. And you can see down the bottom of your screens that we have a lovely discount code for all the books available, and it is JCTTR232FAR, and it gives you 20% off. So if you're looking for a Christmas present for the teacher in your life, or you just want to treat yourself to something to enhance your professional development, then you can go to johncattbookshop.com and have a browse through and treat yourself to something from there. I've got my eye on a few things as well, and I know that there are a few publications coming through that we're going to be talking about in future shows on Teachers Talk Radio. So look out for that as well. So we are going to move on to our next story in just a moment. So up next, we are talking about something that the Children's Commissioner has brought to light recently, and that is that there are too many children of 16, 17 years old who are presenting to their local authority as homeless. And the Children's Commissioner has said, I don't believe we should accept the idea that a child should be considered homeless, particularly at such a young age. And if a 16-year-old cannot live with their own family because they've been kicked out or their relationships are broken down, they are not homeless, they are a child in need of care. And so social care should be stepping up to support these children, and that more needs to be done to ensure that these children are, well, receiving the care and support that they need, but also support as far as their education is concerned. And I know, and I had a look around the Children's Commissioner's website as well, and of course there are all sorts of things in there about attendance in school as well, which this falls into as well. So I suppose, Kathryn, I'm going to come to you first. I mean, have you ever experienced this with anybody you have taught, and what are your thoughts on the idea that this is a focal point at the moment for the Children's Commissioner?
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily, because I take quite an academic role in the school, and my school's quite good at not disclosing things to people who don't need to know them, but I would not be at all surprised. And I think what really struck me about the article and the report is just how, if you look at somebody who's had a relationship with their family breakdown, who's been kicked out, as you say, a lot of people are actually not even presenting at the local authority. They are sofa surfing. So the numbers involved will be, much bigger. It's like, if you see one ant in your kitchen, there is not one ant in your kitchen. There is a bigger problem than that. So I think that's the first thing to acknowledge. And I also think that it's really important to kind of really think about that, who is advocating for these children. I've had a lot to do with looking for SEND support for my own child recently, and you've got to be prepared to be, fight hard, write the letters, make the complaints, all the rest of it. And if there's nobody who's being an advocate for these children, then, it's very easy for them to fall down the cracks. And I think we just need to be really aware of the scale of the issue and make sure that they are supported properly.
Oh, most definitely. And of course, there are always kind of caveats with sort of what the Children's Commissioner means here as well. And in order for these children to receive support, they have to meet certain standards, and it will only allow providers to deliver support, not care. And it's sort of, I think it's one of those things where I suppose there is sort of a little bit of an intention there, but it's kind of, but they have to meet certain levels. They have to, it's sort of not quite right. And John, I wonder what your thoughts are on this. I mean, should there be sort of certain standards and certain kind of caveats, or should it just be a case that actually, no, we need to make sure that all these children are receiving the right support, that we're kind of trying to get them in school, and that we are, I suppose, triangulating or working together with all these services and all these supports in place to ensure that is happening?
Absolutely. Yeah. one phrase that jumped out was the one you indicated, was that we shouldn't consider children, that's people below the age of 18, to be homeless. Declaring them homeless is almost to the sort of almost the privatization of responsibility. It sort of pushes it back to them. You know, there's a problem. It's homelessness. Yeah, I was listening to something on the radio this morning, and so many things right now date back to about 2000, to 13 years, and this long period of austerity, when we see, whether it's the kind of concrete you're using in schools, or it's hospitals, waiting lists, or I know in between that we had a pandemic and so forth. But there is a feeling that lots of things that are happening now are the result of things not started or neglected or cancelled about 10 to 13 years ago. And we're living that right now. But when you say something like, there's a number of children we consider homeless is a terrible idea, but I guess behind it is a long tail, of other things going on. People living in substandard accommodation, people bunking up in bedrooms where there's no particular ability to work. And lots of us as teachers experience the thought that really setting students homework and imagining that there's a nice little place they can study at home with their computer and so on is not actually the case in many of them. The home environment is difficult. Overcrowding, poor quality housing, and homelessness is the tip of a kind of iceberg. Yeah, absolutely. We are, as a society, need to be aware that we have greater responsibilities than we've been taking seriously for these last decade or so.
And I mean, Christopher, coming to you, we wear many hats as teachers, and we talk about it. Some people sort of talk about it as, we have multiple roles, we wear different hats. Where do we fit in here? Because of course we have a huge responsibility and great care towards the children that we teach, but this is almost bigger than us. So what's kind of where do we fit in, and what point do we say actually we need to involve other agencies and other people whose responsibility this is more than ours?
Well, it's a good question to ask. I mean, one of the recommendations from the report was that children should be entitled to care by default, with the Section 20 of the Children's Act provision making care a requirement for the child. I mean, I'm not quite sure how good local authorities are as corporate parents, so I'd have a question about how that could be delivered effectively. I wonder if the solution is actually in better foster care. I think every child should have the right to a family and a family life, and whether foster care offers a solution to that problem that is both state-backed and non-state-backed. I think that would be a good avenue to explore. And I'd also ask the question about, can our state and private boarding schools be asked to do more? Do we have enough state boarding schools in England? If we go back to the original foundation of charity schools, many of them were set up to deal with precisely these kind of problems before we had a big monolithic state education sector. So if the issue is the breakdown of families, then I think we should be looking to help families better manage those things. I mean, ultimately, whatever the solution is, the taxpayers are always going to pay for educational and social care failure sooner or later anyway. Why don't we pay up front to ensure that we give everyone the resources they need to live a good life in 2023?
And care is such a broad term, isn't it? And it applies to so many different areas of life. I mean, it'd be a hard thing to define in sort of simple terms. So really, really interesting. And again, I think one that we will come back to, because it'll be ongoing. So listen out. I'm sure there'll be hosts who will be taking on this and talking about it in more detail. Time to move on to our final story of the morning. Now, financial education has been a big subject that we've talked about recently on Teachers Talk Radio. We've just had Talk Money Week recently, where we've had a number of shows focusing on a number of different areas of financial education. But there is now going to be an inquiry into this. And there is a broad agreement that teaching young people how to manage their finances needs to be reviewed. It's actually been part of the national curriculum in secondary since 2014, but it's kind of focused on sort of citizenship lessons or PSHE lessons. But there is discussion that it should be part of the primary curriculum as well. And so coming to you, John, first on this, do you think it is important? I suppose in a way this is a bit of a daft question, but do you think that sort of from the early days of school that you should be learning about money and how it works and the importance of, you know, understanding it?
Yes, well, possibly. I mean, I certainly, it's very difficult to disagree with the view that understanding finances, personal finances, is not a bad idea. It's a good idea. You know, there's all sorts of, all of us carry some personal experience of, well, I wish I'd known about pensions a bit earlier, or saving money earlier would have been good, and so forth. And not getting into debt, well, debt's a really bad thing. So that once again, when you hear a thing like that, you think, well, it's absolutely sort of common sense. Whether it should be started in primary school, well, yeah, lots of things can be started in primary school. I'd like to think that primary schools are very open-ended and creative sort of places when they look at the society around them, and when students ask what exactly money is and so forth, and if that crops up, or it can be part of a discussion. Yeah, of course, I'd like young people to think about the world around them from an early age. That's great. However, one thing I remember saying years ago to a group of students is that when things appear to be common sense, really, really, really sensible, as this it clearly is, then watch out a little bit, be skeptical, because there's also a sense in which there's some kind of power going on behind the background. In other words, it's in the common sense that you see these social networks of power. I think that teaching students about personal finances is good, but also as they progress into secondary education and beyond, teach them about the kind of financial world they live in, about macro kind of economics. I mean, not just the A-level economic students, but teach the others about inequality, about the distribution of wealth. Because one of the unsaid power things going on when you teach young students about finances is, again, that phrase I used earlier, the privatization of responsibility. You know, the ordinary people who just about manage should be thrifty and careful with their money in a society which is not thrifty and is not careful with money, and there's massive, grotesque inequality. So I think educate students as they move through to social injustice, to the sinews of social injustice that run through society, and make them aware of that. And I don't think we should be afraid, not to the younger ones, you know, tell them about money and such, but as they get older, schools should be aware that when you say to people, avoid debt, be careful, don't waste your money, you're expecting the poor to be thrifty in a society that is very far from thrifty and very far from conscious of waste. And you just look at the story of the pandemic and the money that was spent and money that was wasted, often for people in positions of influence and so on. So the kind of the inequalities should be exposed as part of financial education.
So there was also a Bank of England survey in 2022 that found teachers didn't feel there was kind of the time or the resources to fit this in. And I wonder, Kathryn, sort of what your comment is on that. I mean, do you think that there is room for this in the curriculum, or is it more to do with there could be room if we shifted things around and also maybe got rid of some things that are just don't need to be there, or scaled down on some of the things? Because I often stand as a primary teacher in my classroom and feel that there are parts of the curriculum that just aren't serving even the 8-9-year-olds that I'm teaching. So I wonder your thoughts on space versus validity, if you like.
It links very much to our first discussion, actually, because there's a few things that need to be in place for this to be done successfully. And one of those is teacher confidence and CPD to ensure that they feel confident to deliver it, and there's got to be a coherent curriculum which is properly sequenced, that is age appropriate, and all of those things need to be in place. And if they're not, it becomes very stressful, and particularly in the context of the Ofsted and the measuring and the grades, league tables and things like that, where people rightly or wrongly feel very pressurized. So I'm a great believer in having a proper look at things, and if there's things that are in there that shouldn't be, or there's overlap that can be used wisely, then things should be taken out to prioritize things which we do want to be done properly, because otherwise it's just very superficial and we won't actually address the problem.
Because at the moment, I mean, you sort of, certainly in the primary curriculum, you have maths lessons that are about money and about counting out change and things like that. And in this day and age, I mean, I don't know about all of you, I mean, how much cash any of you carry around, but I certainly don't. And I think there is a danger, certainly amongst young people, and I know this was addressed in a couple of the shows that we looked at during Talk Money Week, where the idea that you can just tap and something happens, or you're not seeing in real time where that money is going, or when these children unfortunately end up using their parents' iPad to buy certain things for games and things like that. So, Christopher, I was wondering, how would you feel about teaching children about the dangers of that, and about potentially, I suppose in some cases children would say, ruining their fun?
Well, I mean, the bigger concern for me is that I agree with John in principle. It's a good idea for us to be looking at financial education in schools. My main concern is I wouldn't want it to become politicized, and that's a big danger on all sides, actually. And the second thing I don't want to become is a qualified financial advisor. I really don't want to add that to my portfolio of roles that I already possess. In terms of what we would teach them, I think, mortgages and pensions are always distant horizon concepts. No one really totally understands them until that horizon approaches, and even then there's some doubt as to whether everyone understands every term and condition of the teacher's pension scheme, for instance, with their recent changes. Advice on saving and paying bills, yes, I think that's important. Advice on how interest rates work both for borrowing and for saving, yes, I think that's important. A clear message on debt, manageable debt, may be a good thing in certain circumstances. That's going to need some quite sophisticated planning and preparation to deliver that message. How income taxes work, yes, that's definitely important, and where that money goes later on is useful for students to know. But perhaps I think in the secondary concept, the best way of teaching financial planning might be to ask students to think about how they might plan to purchase, run and maintain an electric vehicle in the middle of the 21st century. That's likely to introduce them to many of the big finance concepts that we want them to understand before they enter the adult world.
Interesting. So I think, I mean, the conclusion I would draw from sort of what all of you said is that in principle, yes, this is something that needs to happen. But as with all these things, as with all these government inquiries and all these sort of plans that they come up with, careful research, but also ensuring that if you want this to happen, great, and we are all on board, but it's going to require training, it's going to require support, and it's not just something you can go, okay, right, well, off you go, have fun, and let's see how this goes, which, as we know in teaching, does happen quite a lot. Well, so brilliant stuff on all of that. Thank you, everybody. In a moment, we're going to have a look at our favourite shows of the week. Ooh, okay. So who to pick on first for show of the week this week? I'm going to go John first.
Well, the show I'd like to recommend was Hannah Wilson's Equality of Finance, or the Equality of Finance. Not only because I'm attracted by the ideas, you can tell from my previous comment on the ideas of equality and looking at finance in fairness and distribution of understanding and knowledge. I also listen to it, because there were two guests, which I always admire when you can handle two guests on a show. Two guests. It was going out live. It was handled very, very professionally, and it was really just a great listen to two guests who were both experts in their field, both knew what they were talking about, and they were talking about something I don't suppose I really thought about much, was how you deal with a subject like finance and money, and being sensible with money with students in PRUs and with special educational needs and so on. Well, goodness me, that's worth listening to and thinking about. And particularly one idea jumped out was that how guilty people feel about money, and afraid they are to talk about it, and afraid of debt, and afraid of borrowing and so on, in a society that is not guilty about money. They are. So it was a good show.
Fabulous. Christopher, you next.
My favourite show of the week was Sean Mackay's Friday Late Late Show, Teachers and Time. I think it's subsequently prompted some animated discussion about working hours of teachers and what little social time they have left. So download it today and see what all the noise has been about.
Beautifully succinct. Thank you. Kathryn, over to you.
Yes, it's actually a show that I co-hosted with Hannah, where we interviewed Peter Hughes, CEO of the Mossbourne Federation, about his forthcoming book, Outstanding School Leadership. And he is a fascinating guy. The book was absolutely brilliant, and I highly recommend it. And I believe there's a discount code, which you will be able to see online. And it was a really, really good chat. And he's such a personable man. And it made me really think hard about some of my professional behaviours and things that I might want to address as well. So really, really worthwhile and a good listen.
Fabulous. And for me, it was Mr. Tom Hopkins' book, show all about revision. It was a two-parter. In the first part, it was Mike Hobbs. He had on to discuss barriers to effective revision, which was really, really good. And the second part was with Andrew Cohen, who called in all the way from the US to discuss Brainscape, which is his platform that helps with revision as well, and how you can self-quiz and use that to really support your learning. There was also a lot of discussion about the Leitner method, which some of you may or may not be familiar with. And as Tom said to me this morning, Leitner, laugh, love. So apparently people are big fans of that. And if you want to know more and are not aware of it, please do listen into that, or listen back to it, I should say. So just a final reminder, everybody, that this show is indeed brought to you by John Catt, as Kathryn mentioned earlier, which publishes all kinds of wonderful books centered around education. So if you are looking to treat yourself to a Christmas present, or indeed the teacher in your life to a Christmas present, or just looking to enhance your professional development, then you can use the code JCTTR2324 for a 20% discount. And the website for that is johncattbookshop.com. So thank you very much to my panel today, to Chris, to John, and to Kathryn, and we will see you again next week.